My name is Lucas. I'm 34 years old, and I'm an investigative journalist. I've spent the last 5 years of my life diving into dark stories, the kind no one wants to tell. But this story is different. It haunted me. Literally. It all started 3 months ago when I received an anonymous call at 3 in the morning. The person on the other end of the line only said one sentence before hanging up. "They're listening." At the time, I thought it was some bizarre prank, but then things started happening. Things I still can't explain to this day. This story takes place in a small town called Vale das Sombras, a place that seems straight out of a nightmare. You've probably never heard of it, and maybe that's intentional. Because here, crimes aren't just crimes. They're inspired by something much older and much more dangerous. But before we get into that, let me ask you a question. What if everything you know about evil is wrong? What if the real culprit behind some of humanity's worst atrocities isn't human? I arrived at Vale das Sombras on a gray afternoon. The sky seemed to press down on the town like a metal lid, and the air had a strange smell. Something between wet earth and something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was fear. I'm not sure. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence you find in the countryside, but a heavy one, as if people were holding their breath. The few who wandered the streets looked at me with suspicion. It was as if they knew who I was before I even opened my mouth. I went straight to the local inn, an old place called Posada do Lago. The owner, Dona Mariana, was an elderly woman with gray hair and tired eyes. When I asked about the crimes happening in the town, she simply shook her head and said, "You shouldn't poke around this, young man." But of course, that only made me more curious. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard something that still sends chills down my spine to this day. A scream. It didn't come from the street, but from inside my own head. It was sharp, desperate, and seemed to echo through every corner of the room. I knew I wasn't drowsy. That was real. Or at least, part of it was. The next morning, I went to the local police station. The officer on duty, a burly man named Chief Almeida, reluctantly received me. He confirmed that the town had a series of unsolved violent crimes over the past few years. Brutal murders, mysterious disappearances, unexplainable suicides. But there was something he didn't want to admit. Something I would only discover after much insistence. "These people," he said, pointing to a pile of dusty files on his desk, "they didn't act alone." When I asked what he meant, he just muttered, "This town holds secrets that not even God would forgive." With the chief's words echoing in my mind, I decided to dive deep into the police archives. He gave me permission to examine some old cases, but there was something strange. Many of the reports were incomplete or had been deliberately altered. It was as if someone, or something, didn't want me to know the full truth. The first case that caught my attention was that of a man named João Carlos. He was an apparently ordinary family man until, on a stormy night, he took an axe and killed his entire family while they slept. The reason? According to his statement before being arrested, he said that a voice had ordered him to do it. A voice that promised power and glory in exchange for obedience. But the scariest part wasn't that. It was a detail that no one officially mentioned. During the interrogation, João Carlos began speaking in an unknown language. The officer said it sounded like Latin, but no expert could identify exactly what it was. And then, 2 days later, he was found dead in his cell, hanged, but without a rope. Another case that chilled me to the bone was that of Maria Clara, a 22-year-old woman who disappeared after going out for a walk at night. Her body was found weeks later in an abandoned well on the outskirts of town. But here's the macabre detail. When investigators arrived at the scene, they found claw marks on the ground around the well, huge claw marks, as if something had dragged Maria Clara there. And then there are the suicides. Not just one or two, several. They all have something in common. The victims reported, shortly before dying, that they constantly heard voices. Voices that said terrible things, things that drove them completely insane. The more I read, the more I noticed a terrifying pattern. All these crimes seemed to be connected by something bigger, something invisible. And then I found a clue that would change everything. An eyewitness, a man named Sebastião, who swore he had seen something roaming the forest near the town on the nights when the crimes occurred. Sebastião was a simple-looking man with stubble on his face and deep-set eyes that seemed to carry years of suffering. He lived in a cabin on the edge of the forest, isolated from the rest of the town. When I arrived, he was sitting on the porch, drinking something that looked like stale coffee. "You shouldn't be here," were the first words he said when he saw me. There was no threat in his voice, just exhaustion. But I needed to know what he had seen. After much insistence, he finally began to speak. "I heard the screams first," he said, looking at the ground as if reliving that moment. "They came from the forest, but they weren't human screams. They were different, like something was hunting." He told me he decided to investigate, even though he knew it could be dangerous. When he entered the forest, he felt something strange in the air, a sense of heaviness, as if the environment itself was alive and watching. That's when he saw it. A tall, slender figure with arms too long and a head that seemed to melt at the edges. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its mouth moved without making a sound, but Sebastião swore he could hear voices inside his mind. "I didn't stay there long," he admitted, trembling as he remembered. "I ran back home and locked all the doors. But it's still out there. I know it is." Before I left, he handed me something he had found in the forest, a piece of wood covered with strange symbols, as if they had been carved with nails. He said these symbols appeared out of nowhere in the clearing where he saw the creature. When I returned to the inn, I spent hours examining that piece of wood. The symbols looked ancient, almost primitive, but something about them caught my attention. It was as if they were trying to tell me something. And then I realized they formed a pattern I had seen before in the crime reports. That night was long. As I stared at that piece of wood, I began to draw connections between the symbols and the crimes I had investigated so far. They were everywhere, in the photos of the crime scenes, on the walls of the victims' homes, even in the notebooks of some of the killers. It was as if that entity left its mark on everything it touched. But there was something more, something I hadn't noticed until I decided to visit the local library. There I found an old book about the history of Vale das Sombras. It was written over 100 years ago by a priest who lived in the area. He mentioned a local legend about an entity known as the Whisperer. According to the legend, this creature was a vengeful spirit that haunted the forest and manipulated human thoughts to punish those who disrespected the sacred land where the town was built. The story said that centuries ago, before the arrival of the colonizers, that place was a sacred territory for an indigenous tribe. They performed rituals there to appease the Whisperer, keeping it dormant. But when the colonizers arrived, they desecrated the soil, cutting down trees and building their homes without respecting local traditions. Since then, the entity awakened and began influencing the town's inhabitants, driving them into chaos and violence. The most terrifying part is that the priest wrote that the only way to stop the Whisperer was to perform a specific purification ritual, but no one knew exactly how to do it. He warned that any attempt to confront the entity without following the correct instructions could result in catastrophic consequences. That night, as I read the book, I felt something strange, a feeling that I was being watched. I looked up and saw, through the window, a tall, slender figure standing across the street. It didn't move, but its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. When I blinked, it was gone. I knew I was running out of time. In the following days, I delved even deeper into researching the ritual mentioned by the priest. I found fragments of ancient texts and accounts from people who had attempted the ritual in the past but failed. Some of them simply disappeared, others went insane. One thing was clear: the ritual required a sacrifice. Not just any sacrifice, but something personal, something that truly mattered to whoever performed it. I decided I had to try. There was no other option. The town was on the verge of collapse, and I knew the Whisperer was growing stronger with each passing day. I gathered the necessary materials, rare herbs found in the surrounding area, candles made from pure beeswax, and the piece of wood with the symbols that Sebastian had given me. On the night of the ritual, I returned to the forest. I chose a clearing where I felt the energy was thickest, as if the very air was charged with malice. I drew the symbols on the ground with white chalk and lit the candles. When everything was ready, I began to recite the words I had found in the ancient texts. They were guttural, difficult to pronounce, as if my tongue wasn't meant to form them. At first, nothing happened, but then the wind stopped completely. The silence was absolute. And then I heard those voices again, whispers coming from all directions, echoing inside my mind. "You cannot stop me," said a cold, almost metallic voice. "I am part of this land now." The figure appeared before me, taller and more imposing than ever. Its eyes glowed with terrifying intensity, and its long hands seemed ready to grab me. But I couldn't back down. I took the object I had brought as a sacrifice, an old photo of my family, the only thing I had left of them, and threw it into the fire. For a moment, I thought I had failed. But then, something changed. The entity screamed, a sound so loud and high-pitched that it brought me to my knees. The flames of the candles grew, enveloping it in a blinding white light. And then, it vanished. When I returned to the town, I realized something had changed. People seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from them. The crimes stopped, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Vale das Sombras finally dissipated. But I knew the Whisperer wasn't completely defeated. It was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next careless soul who dared to disturb it. This story doesn't end here. As I write this, I know the evil I faced in Vale das Sombras may still be alive in other places, other towns, other forests. If you enjoyed this story, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more investigations like this one. And if you know any legends or similar cases, share them in the comments. Who knows, your story might be the next mystery I explore. Until then, remember, not everything that whispers is human. Good night.